Yeah. A very good evening to everyone. My name is Praveen Singh and I am the Director of Financial Services at Mulla Group. It's my pleasure to host you today for the webinar Learn to Protect Your Digital Assets that is being conducted by Mr. Sourabh Sharma, Director Ernst & Young. Thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar. As we are taking our business into a very fast-paced digital environment, we can see already some new challenges that is coming up. In the time of COVID pandemic, we all went digital. That became the new norm. That became a new norm for our survival. And this would also mean that majority of our assets might be vulnerable to the attack from malicious operator all across the world. The plan of fraudsters are very simple. They try to find the most vulnerable loophole in our business's network, and they will try to find various methods to extract the fund from us. And that poses some questions that we need to ask ourselves. Question number one, what are those type of attacks that can possibly happen? Question two, and how we can protect ourselves and our businesses from these scenarios. For Mulla Exchange, we feel that our most important assets are our customers. It is your success that determines ours. And so we feel it's quite essential for us to bring an expert on cybersecurity to talk about this in the best interest of our clients. We were reading recently something about this various cybersecurity attacks that various globally it is happening, various companies are facing these kind of challenges. And one data says that in 2019, more than 4 billion records were compromised. And till that time, it was considered the worst year of record for data breaches. But unfortunately, 2020, it surpassed 2019. They're considering this was a devastating year for data breaches as well. Many famous companies globally known, Marriott, Nintendo, EasyJet, they all were attacked and they face the crippling consequence of those cyber attacks. And very recently, we might be reading about Twitter, and they have declared that it has fallen victim to a very coordinated social engineering attack. And they saw the accounts of politicians, celebrities, many famous people, and that send out tweets offering to pay a sender double any amount that met to a Bitcoin wallet address. And they also hackers, they reset the password of around 130 accounts targeted. So we can see that cybersecurity by the name, it looks like that is something, a threat very far away, but actually it is not very far away and it is lurking at every corner of us. And we have found the best person in Kuwait probably available to us who can talk about this. Mr. Sourabh Sharma, he is a partner consulting cybersecurity and technology risk at Ernst & Young Kuwait. He has got 13 years of experience in field of IT governance, IT service management, security governance, operating model and risk assessment. He has worked with multiple clients in India and Middle East on cybersecurity domain. And then with this, I'd like to hand over presentation to Mr. Sharma. Sourabh, over to you. Please address our customers.
Thank you, Praveen, and good evening to everybody. So I hope everybody can see the screen. So I would like to welcome everybody, to this webinar today. And I think Mr. Praveen gave off a very nice introduction about the subject that we are going to cover here. We will go through this, the next hour through various facets of cybersecurity. What are the attacks, how they are costing the organizations. We will then move on to the risks and then what we can do. So from, I just like to introduce, I think Praveen, you did a fantastic job. I'll not take more time on it. Just as a brief introduction, I'm a partner with EY. I am based out of Kuwait. I have also worked in Oman. I believe this webinar is also being presented and shared with Oman. So here I do support the security teams in mentoring. I do, work with the board of directors and the executives within the organizations to help them, assist them, and guide them on how to secure their organizations. So from an agenda perspective, we will go over this with a very methodical approach. As I said, we will first cover, what is a cyber attack? How does it impact an organization? And then, what are the cost of those breaches? And then what can be done? We will also look at the current and the emerging cyber risks and how they are very relevant to the organizations, not just in the Middle East, but also globally. With that said, we will also talk about and cover key focus areas on which organizations need to enhance their security posture and what are some of the domains on which the organizations can work upon. And lastly, and I think this is very, very, very relevant, which is around how do we adapt cybersecurity in an uncertain environment, which is basically the COVID-19 era. So to begin with, you would have heard a lot from cybersecurity professionals, from media, that it is just a matter of time before an organization will suffer a cyber attack. In fact, people go to an extent saying that a lot of organizations would have already suffered a cyber attack, but they may not know about it. And hence, because of the impact that cybersecurity attacks can cause on an organization, or even from a state perspective on countries, it no longer is just a technology issue. It's basically very relevant to the business and the environment we are operating in. Now, what is cyber, or let's say, what is cybersecurity? So basically, in today's world, and especially during COVID-19 era, a lot of organizations adopted remote working. People increased the pace of digital adoption, going live on multiple fronts, whether it is channels to support their businesses, whether implementing multiple ERPs, upgrading their network infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So cybersecurity is about protecting all of that to make sure that technology can support the business objectives. Now, because of its importance and technology being a central pillar in driving strategies within the organizations, what we also see is rising threats. And we are not covering here, for example, large attacks that are very complex and sophisticated in nature, but simple connectivity devices or devices who have internet to operate, such as smart homes, having refrigerators, having smart meterings these days. These are the devices which are connected to the internet, which connect millions of people, and hence they are a very prime target. And hence cybersecurity is the #1 technology risk today. The estimated cost of cybercrime is, there is no specific cost, but it is estimated that it is over $1 trillion across the globe. And this is all on what has been reported. What we must understand is a lot of these issues, a lot of the attacks, the organizations don't report them because it causes reputational damage, and hence this cost may be very less as compared to the actual one. What we've also seen is because of the advancement of technologies and multiple players coming in, the cost of that single service provider, whether it is a service provider around your connectivity on internet, or whether it is a service provider of payment systems, such as SWIFT, for example, the cost of damage, or let's say the overall impact on the supply chain for an organization can range between $50 to $120 billion. This is not a direct impact on the organization, but on the service provider, which will further cause service disruption. And a very key element to note here is that why organizations find it hard to mitigate cyber risks and actually respond to an attack is because an attacker would always attempt to very stealthily gain access to the networks. And that's why you see it's over 100 days when an actual attack gets noticed. So this is just to set up the context of what is cybersecurity, why it is an increasing risk for organizations, and what is the impact of cybersecurity hacks or attacks quantitatively. Now, let's just see how it has evolved, how the cybersecurity attacks have evolved over the years. So back in 1990s, when the networks were very simple, what we have seen is that there was a group of hackers called script kiddies. These are basically college-going, students or somebody who's just trying it for amusement or experimentation, whereby the impact was not that large, but it was just out of curiosity that somebody wanted to see what he or she can accomplish. The next category, or let's say the next step in the evolution of cybersecurity attacks, came through hackers, which is also the term that we use today as well, where specific individuals were targeted, whether be it for money purposes or it's a personal rivalry, or maybe some social and environmental causes, which is also called hacktism, meaning hacking for a cause that we believe in. From there on, the next step is basically the malicious insiders, where maybe the competition wants to impact their rivals. They want to basically manipulate their stock prices, or you have somebody, an employee, which is disgruntled and wants to cause harm to your organization. And that is where this category came, where people with adequate knowledge of offensive cybersecurity tools wanting to cause harm to the organization that they work in or the organization that they're competing against. This has now evolved into criminal networks, whereby this is no more just one person working out of his room, or let's say a basement trying to attack the organizations, but more so forming a network of criminals over something called as dark web, which is let's say the internet, the parallel internet that basically hosts all of these activities. And this is being now the network of hackers is they are using each other's information, their IP, to cause attacks at a larger scale. Now, what we have seen is that when we talk about wars between different countries, it's no more a full spectrum war, but rather each and every state are trying to target and gain more information on other countries, whether be it for competitive advantage, whether it is for global ratings, or whether there is a military advantage over there. And that is where the rise of state-sponsored attacks have really increased. And now what all of these category of hackers or adversaries are trying to adopt digital technologies whereby the attacks can be more sophisticated, more efficient, and more silent in nature, whether it be through robotics, be it through artificial intelligence, to ensure that when somebody attacks, it is on multiple fronts. So at the end of the day, the organizations find it very difficult to respond to such attacks. And this we see is continuously evolving. The traditional networks such as payment systems, or for example, the oil and gas network, which used to be segregated from the IT network in the organization, that is no more the case. It is a very connected and digital world now, and we continue to evolve in that journey. And hence, the cybersecurity attacks have also increased in the sophistication and the impact that they can cause. Now, EY conducts a global survey. So we conducted a survey this year in 2021. Around 1,400 organizations participated in that. And the findings, they are really of big concern. So I'll take you through some of the findings. So CISO is something called as a Chief Information Security Officer or a Head of Security. Now, if you look at the statistics, nearly 43% CISOs have reported that they don't have the ability to manage the cyber threats, and this is a very alarming number. 47% or close to 50%, they have admitted that the organizations and them leading as head of security or cybersecurity, they do not understand the strategies that are being adopted by attackers. And more so, if you talk about the budgets which are allocated to cybersecurity, it is always allocated as a part of an overall IT budget and never as a dedicated budget. And what we've also seen is, apart from the attacks that are happening, the compliance pressure now that is being put on by the regulators and the rigor that they want the organizations to adopt is really increasing. And so most of the organizations, whenever they're working on cybersecurity, it is largely compliance driven. And what this does is, at the end of the day, it causes a lot of pressure on IT, a lot of pressure on cybersecurity teams just to comply to the requirements. And ultimately, sometimes the real threat actors, they get ignored. Now, I would want to, take you through some of the very recent attacks that we have seen in the first half of the year, starting with Microsoft Exchange Server. And if you remember a couple of slides back, we talked about state-sponsored attacks where one country is targeting another one. So for whether it is for economic advantage, military advantage, or so many number of reasons. Now this attack was targeting the Microsoft Exchange server, or the email server as we commonly know it, whereby the attackers injected a code and from there on were able to download and get access to a lot of attachments, a lot of emails, and this was not very specific to one organization. This was for many organizations within the US, and it happened because there were 4 key weaknesses in the Exchange server that were compromised, and Microsoft was not aware of it. So they termed it as a zero-day attack, meaning the attack which has not been known in the market, and it's the first time that Microsoft saw that. Now, it is believed, for example, the US government has put allegations on the Chinese government that this was, the attackers were from China, and this was not just to steal data, but rather a very small step in an overall scheme of seeing what is the pattern of US citizens and residents and how they can leverage this data to achieve better artificial intelligence and hence gain the competitive advantage. The second one was the Colonial Pipeline attack, and this attack has made the news, in May, where a Colonial Pipeline is an oil and gas company which basically caters to the hydrocarbons flowing from Texas all the way up to New York. So they faced a ransomware attack on their billing systems, which basically caused the service delivery capabilities. And in fact, President Biden declared an emergency because of this attack. The company, they paid $4.4 million, and even FBI was involved in this. The next is the Acer ransomware attack, where the tech giant Acer, they suffered a huge ransomware attack. It's called Arrival, and they had to pay a ransom of $50 million. And the last one is about the Cognizant attack, which is again a large tech giant, which faced an attack by the Maze ransomware. So what this ransomware does is it will duplicate the data, it will send the copy out, and it will also encrypt the data of the organization so that they can be made, for example, they can be forced into payment. Now, if you see this, 3 out of these 4 very recent examples are large technology companies. And what we mean by this is that, at the end of the day, all of these companies have world-class capabilities. They have world-class tools and technologies. Cybersecurity budget is not a problem. Still, they faced massive cybersecurity attacks. And that is why we say, what we prefaced at the start, that this is just this particular risk will impact everybody. Now, let's look at, what is the state, or let's say, what is the level of comfort that the organizations have when it comes to cybersecurity risks. So out of that GSS survey, what we saw was that only 20% of the respondents mentioned that they're confident that they can address the cybersecurity risks. They have a very robust program in which periodically they determine their risks and deploy mitigation strategies or countermeasures. But the remaining 80% of the respondents said they do not understand how the risks, or let's say, what are the cyber threats and how they can mitigate. Now, if I draw your attention on the left side, these are the domains. So there are about 20 or 16 domains, largely around cybersecurity, which needs to be addressed, which starts from governance, which means you need to have solid teams on the ground who should be reporting to the highest level possible. And there are regulations in place to support the organizations in terms of their direction and the minimum compliance criteria. If you go to the bottom right, you see people, process, and technology being a key pillar, whereby not just the skills, but cybersecurity awareness is also one of the important pillars to basically prevent the attacks in the first attempt. From a threat landscape perspective, there are many threat actors that may be working against the organizations, but they again largely fall around the technology vulnerabilities. So weaknesses in the technology landscape, weaknesses in understanding what is a phishing, for example, activity, what is a social engineering activity, and employees who do not have a technology or a cybersecurity background fall victim to this. And on the last part is on controls and monitoring, which is basically the controls which you deploy within an organization to ensure that tactically and operationally you address cybersecurity through controls. So if you sum it up, this is an issue which is at the agenda of the boards, which is in the agenda of cybersecurity executives, and to address cybersecurity as a discipline within the organization, the teams have to work on a lot of fronts, a lot of domains, just to make sure that they can prevent the commodity attacks. And I'm not talking about the advanced attacks, but just the commodity attacks. So let's look at what are the current and emerging cyber risks. So this risk landscape, it basically represents a combination of cybersecurity issues. So you have the new technology elements coming in, whether it is artificial intelligence, whether it is robotics, or for example, companies entering financial services space, such as fintech or e-commerce. And this is something that is causing a lot of risks, emerging risks within the organization overall risk landscape. If you look at on the left side, on the current threat landscape, you'll see the risks that basically cause all of these weaknesses to be impacting the organizations. So if you look at here, you have shadow IT. So basically within a large organization, you may have parallel IT teams working. You may have people falling victim to social engineering or ransomware, or adopting cloud services without really understanding what that journey means before you adopt cloud. There are other risks such as supply chain, where as an organization, you may not be directly getting impacted, but a critical vendor that has been facing a cybersecurity attack can ultimately impact you as well as an organization. Now, if you come here, all of this has resulted in so many cybersecurity attacks. Largely what we have now seen is that attackers are now going in a very sophisticated manner because the hacking community has realized one thing, that it is possible to get money out of organizations which are not even from a financial services background. So they don't need to target banks. They don't need to target individual people who have bank accounts, who have credit cards. But if you launch a sophisticated attack and you basically ask a ransom to be paid, organizations are willing to do that because they fear the loss of data, they fear reputational damage. And on top of that, on this side, if you see, What we have seen is that regulators are trying to keep up pace with these issues. So whether it be the central banks of the countries, be it the telecom regulatory authorities, what they're trying to do is they're trying to come up with regulations and control frameworks to help the clients or to help the organizations. However, the challenge here is that again, all of these compliance standards are based on minimum compliance criteria. They do not address, or they are incapable to address, a very sophisticated targeted attack. So this is a summary of what does the current risk landscape looks like for organizations. And this is agnostic of the sector. This applies to banking and capital markets. This applies to oil and gas. This applies to family groups, telecommunication operators, and so on and so forth. Now let's look at this. So if you talk about first the insider threat, and this is one of the key things that we have seen, we have in fact noticed because we have helped so many organizations in responding to cyber attacks, that sometimes it's not the capability of the attacker or the adversary and the sophisticated attacks that they can launch, but more so if they can target an individual who is not happy within the current organization on helping them from inside in gaining access. The second part or the key element what we have seen here are the supply chain attacks. Now, to cut costs and bring in efficiencies, organizations are outsourcing, and the outsourcing trend is going upwards. Now, these vendors to whom the organizations are outsourcing to their critical processes, such as, for example, outsourcing of IT, those organizations may have a good, robust cybersecurity practice, but unfortunately, if the vendor is not big in terms of investing in cybersecurity, they ultimately either will cause an unauthorized access or they will cause unauthorized sharing of confidential data, or maybe which may not be voluntarily, but since their cybersecurity mitigation strategies are not up to the mark, they will eventually cause the data to be leaked. The third one, and this is a very critical one, is what we have seen is attack on payment systems. Now, all the third-party providers such as MasterCard, Visa, there are a couple of others like American Express and so on and so forth. They work with SWIFT systems, which is the payment network provider. Now, what we have seen is that if an organization, if a banking organization is impacted by this, the financial loss is very significant. We have helped banks in responding to incidents north of $150 million where the money was stolen through a network of corresponding banks. We saw in 2016 where almost $1 billion were attempted to be stolen, and still the attackers were able to steal almost $81 million. And this is something which is always on the radar of many adversaries, many attackers. And the fourth is the cloud insecurity. Now, what we have seen is that organizations, what they do is, again, for the cost efficiencies and to reduce the load of capital expenditure, organizations adopt cloud. However, a few full due diligence is not done. So in terms of what are the controls that the cloud provider will provide? What is the responsibility of the organization that is going on cloud in terms of controls? And sometimes, the responsibility of implementing cybersecurity controls get lost in this translation. So again, just to sum up on this slide, what we are trying to say here is that the complexity is increasing, the frequency is increasing, and while technology adoption, even in COVID-19 era, it's really gaining traction. However, as organizations, what we need to understand is how do we profile ourselves from a cyber security or let's say cyber risk vantage point, and then address those through systematic implementation of countermeasures. The other part, what we have seen is the rapid deployment of technology and in fact the changes in the technology. So a lot of organizations are developing software in-house to cater to their business needs. And a lot of times security is ignored as a fundamental element. The other thing that we have seen is, and this is largely for advanced organizations where they want to adopt robotic process automation, whereby while the robots or the bots are being deployed, which are basically software programs to automate a particular task, but the governance mechanisms around that and the kind of information that those programs will have access to is not controlled. What we've also seen is that a lot of organizations are now looking at how their users or employees behave to identify any anomalous behavior, which can then lead to a cybersecurity attack. And the use of analytics into this space is growing day by day exponentially. So as a countermeasure, a lot of organizations are now looking at implementing blockchain as a technology to secure, or let's say provide a secure platform for many processes. So blockchain, you might have heard the name, can be adopted for many processes, be it the payment systems, or for example, be it for your internal procurement, and so on and so forth. Now, the steps what we need to take here as organizations is, if we are going to cloud, if we are doing in-house software development, or we are looking to adopt RPA, we need to set the hygiene correctly, which means we need to look at the current risks that we face. We need to conduct risk assessments on these emerging technologies and address those risks in a best possible manner. Sometimes all of the risks cannot be mitigated, so hence they need to be monitored to make sure that when we actually adopt these technologies, we are aware of our risks, and we can also give responsibility to the partner or the vendor that is helping you in going live with these technologies. Now, there have been so many incidents. We spoke about 4 key incidents. Mr. Praveen Singh mentioned a couple of incidents with Marriott, with Twitter, and so on and so forth. In a nutshell, there are many ways to reduce the possibility of these events happening and hence disrupting the operations or basically causing reputational damage. The first one is that cybersecurity should be treated with the seriousness that it demands, which means you need to have teams within the organizations which are capable and which can address this issue and understand what business requires from technology and cybersecurity. And that's a very critical link. A lot of times we have seen that cybersecurity teams do not understand what are the business objectives. And hence, when an organization goes for deployment of cloud, robotics, they are not involved. The second part is creating a cybersecurity aware culture within the organizations, whether it is through policies and procedures, whether it is through security awareness, or embedding cybersecurity teams amongst the large programs that organizations implement. There are many facets which you can address, but the important part here is to embed this as a culture rather than as an overhead. The third part is around getting the response capabilities up. Now, one thing we must acknowledge that we really cannot control all the risks that we may be subject to. So what we need to do is increase our immunity to cybersecurity attacks and have response capabilities in terms of clear responsibilities on who will respond to cybersecurity incidents, so that in case we do face an incident, we are in the best possible position to respond. And a lot of these things rely on getting the basics right. So it is, while the attacks may be sophisticated, but the first instance when the attack is launched is always to target an employee or a particular system. So if the systems are appropriately configured, if the employees are properly trained, there is a huge probability that the impact or the attack will not be successful. And then depending on the budget and depending on the future strategies, organizations can also adopt robotics, not just for business processes, but also in terms of deploying cybersecurity capabilities. So when it comes to the organizations facing all of these complex attacks, what we have to understand is that the attack will start at a very small, threat surface, which means that any attacker, when he or she will target either you as an individual or as an organization, the first goal will be to get access to the information that is important to them, and to do that in a very stealthy way. Now, why people do this? Again, it can be for economic gain. It can be for money. It can be about proving an attacker's capability, or it can be for a social cause that the attacker believes in. So some of the common types of cyber attacks that you would have seen, and the common type these days is a malware attack, and we will cover some of these categories because some of these categories are very technical in nature. So we'll try to cover some which are largely people related. The second type of attacks are social engineering attacks, where the attacker will target an individual or a team within the organization. The third one is phishing attacks, and this is the most common one. And largely what we have seen is that a combination of malware and phishing attack is something that has a very high probability of going through and basically causing an impact on the organization. The remaining categories are related to, or are, let's say, technical in nature, where denial of service or distributed denial of service means that an attacker wants to cause a service disruption that your organization is providing, so which will basically impact the organizations commercially as well as causing reputational damage. So let's look at what is malware. So malware is basically malicious ware, and so the first part is malicious, the second part is ware. Ware means a program which can either run by itself or needs a certain level of input to run. And malwares are of various types. So you have spywares, you have viruses, and so on and so forth. These are basically the programs that, if implanted within an organization, they, with a certain level of input, will give access, either a network access or an access to internal data of the organization to the attacker. What malware can do is that it can either basically take off your critical components of the network. So it can bring down the services. It can basically exfiltrate data out of your organization to an adversary, or it can basically cause a system to be inoperable and hence making it unavailable. All of these attacks, or let's say ransomware, they are targeted attacks, and hence they are sent through phishing emails, through malicious websites, or causing somebody to believe, in downloading an infected file. The second attack is called social engineering. Again, social engineering is basically you manipulate an individual to believe in something and then making them to act on what you require as an attacker. The way social engineering works is it's again a very sophisticated attack, whereby first of all the attacker would gain information on you. So for example, what are your interests, what projects you are doing right now, and so on and so forth. And basis that they will send targeted communication to you, and the attacker would want you to believe that communication is very genuine in nature. So when you click a link that you receive in a phishing email, you will not find it suspicious. And then through that, the attacker will try to gain access to your environment. And what we have seen is that attackers will not immediately start exploitation. They will basically get an access. They will become an insider within an organization, and then they will silently monitor the network and see, how is the overall network architecture looks like, what are the systems, and try to gain access to this information. And once they're ready, they will run the exploitation phase. Social engineering, of course, has many impacts. You can have, like, for example, Sony faced a massive attack where they lost, their IP. It can cause financial loss. It can also give unauthorized access to the attacker, and not just one account, from one account to the other, till the time the attacker can actually get access to the entire network. So again, there are many use cases of social engineering for attackers. It is one of the most successful attacks that can be launched, and the impact is really huge. Just various type of social engineering. So phishing is the most common, where you get a fraudulent email, where the perpetrator will try to behave like somebody who's within your organization or who's a person of interest for you. There is spam, where you get bulk messages, pretexting, again, so on and so forth. So many type of social engineering attacks can be launched. And what you see here is malware, social engineering, phishing. The attackers will launch a combination of these attacks to make sure that the chances of success is high. So how do we avoid social engineering? Again, this is something that requires basic hygiene, basic discipline. So if you receive any email, any phishing email, you should always be skeptical about it. You should call the person if you believe, if you think that the email is not right and it is coming from somebody who's trying to pose like a known person. You should always call that person and confirm if he or she sent that email to you. Whenever you post information online, specifically on LinkedIn, which is again a professional network, always make sure that you post information in a minimalistic manner. So for example, I would never put my information on LinkedIn if I'm working like as a Swift administrator or an IT administrator, managing Microsoft, managing Linux, and so on. So, so many technologies on LinkedIn, because that will give attackers first-hand information of what is your technology infrastructure. Always be careful in opening the attachments. So if you think that the attachment is and the email is fishy and the attachment is not right, consult with your security or IT teams. Whenever you are in doubt, always call the help desk, again, be it the IT teams or the security teams, to make sure that you double check if that information or let's say the email is right or it's a fraudulent email. And then always a couple of basic stuff, lock your screen if you are, for example, if you're leaving your equipment in public places. Sometimes we do work while we are traveling in a cafe or at airports. So make sure that you lock the screen if your equipment is unattended. The third one is around phishing. Now, phishing, it's again targeting certain individuals, but through the channel of email, right? And what we have seen is, and in fact, we have seen attackers launching successful attacks whereby they, for example, will ask the finance department, they will pose as a CEO or higher executive, they will ask the finance department to process the invoice. And once the finance department processes the invoice, it does not actually go to the vendor, but it goes to the perpetrator. Now, phishing again, this is a very common source of attack, because even if you have blocked internet, email is still a channel that will allow access to the outside world, or let's say to the it will allow access to the adversary, so that the adversary can reach out to you and launch this attack. Now, a couple of things, and there are some very basic things that you can do to make sure that you're not a target of phishing. So always look at the language of email that is coming to you. These attackers, their command on English language is generally not good. So you will find a lot of grammatical mistakes, a lot of spelling mistakes, and then you can find out that, this might be a phishing email. The other thing that you can do is move your mouse cursor on the email ID, and you will see that the email ID in the to field will say something else. But when you point your cursor on that particular email ID, like how I'm pointing now, you will see that the email ID that pops up is different. So these are some of the things, basic steps that you can do to avoid being a target of a phishing attack. Again, common type of phishing. It is spear phishing. These are many types of phishing attacks which are very targeted in nature. You'll see out of the most common ones are either botnets, which is basically compromising a lot of workstations, a lot of computers to launch a targeted attack on an organization. Spear phishing, where you will have somebody targeting a group of people. Voice phishing, where a criminal will call you and behave like he's calling from a call center, from a bank. Your account needs urgent attention. He or she will ask you about your account number and card details, and so on and so forth. And again, what you need to do here is really be skeptical about when somebody is calling you, what information they're asking and why they're asking. Make sure that if somebody is sending you a phishing email and that person you always double check with the person that if he or she has sent you a request to execute. And if you do all of these basic control mitigation steps, the attacker will find it hard to target you. So we talked about the attacks, the various type of attacks that organizations have faced, and then common threat actors, that will target individuals, which is your malware, ransomware, phishing, social engineering. Now let us look at what are the areas which the organizations need to prioritize to have a robust cybersecurity ecosystem. So the first one is to have an adequate cyber risk management and governance practice. What it means is that the organizations must have defined teams who are capable to address cybersecurity. They must have a reporting line to the highest possible responsibility. It can be, for example, it can be CEO if that is something that the CEO wishes to do. It can be head of risk. It also can be head of IT sometimes, where the cybersecurity teams report to the IT. Although it is not preferred to have it like that because IT and security need to be independent of each other. But the governing principle here is that you need to have teams on the ground in a proper structure reporting to somebody who has authority within the organization. The second point around cybersecurity risk management and governance is to have policies and procedures in place which are regularly reviewed and aligned with leading standards of cybersecurity. And there are so many available, so you don't have to work on anything from scratch or from your thought process. There are standards available in the market. There are a lot of frameworks that are free of cost that you can leverage. And then conducting risk assessment exercises on periodic basis. So you proactively define and identify what are your risks. The second pillar, which is a very, very important pillar to address from a cybersecurity perspective, is identity and access management, which means that your access management procedures, which basically refers to who will get access to your systems, to your emails, that whole process needs to be governed properly. Because when an attacker wants to target you, the first step that he or she will want to successfully execute is to gain an access within your environment. And hence identity and access management is a very important domain when it comes to cybersecurity. And with leading technologies coming in place, again, such as cloud, robotics, this is an area which needs a lot of focus. The third part is, and this is a practice which is done in a lot of mature markets like US, Europe, and again, some of the emerging markets such as China, India, Brazil. This is a trend that is picking up, that now organizations also want to assess what are the cyber security risks that are relevant to their suppliers, so that they can understand what is the risk exposure that third party or a supplier is going to cause to them and then address it accordingly. In fact, this is now becoming part of contract negotiations with the suppliers, where organizations are asking the suppliers to prove that they have robust cybersecurity practices. And this also then links to the second element, which is having a cybersecurity insurance. So if you today go and you want to take cybersecurity insurance, the insurer will ask you about this particular domain as well. The fourth one is around cyber resilience, which is to basically have advanced response capabilities, which is some of the organizations implement something called as a security operations center, which is 24/7 monitoring of the network and the activities that are going in, so that organizations can almost in real time identify an incident and respond to that. The fifth one is around advanced cyber testing. Again, this is around trying to test your own systems to understand what are the vulnerabilities. And there are a lot of assessments. There is something called as a red team assessment, where an organization engages with a third party who will act like a hacker and will try to exploit your systems and network almost without zero knowledge. So the third party will have to do a lot of research. They will have to be prepared in terms of data, and then they will launch targeted attacks on organizations, and they will basically mimic a scenario where how an attacker will basically cause harm to the organization. The sixth one is around cyber innovation. Again, this is about adopting leading technologies such as blockchain, robotics, artificial intelligence to increase the maturity of your cybersecurity practices within the organization. This is something that a lot of organizations are not doing because it is an evolving space. But in the coming 3 to 4 years or 3 to 5 years, you will see a lot of service offerings coming on this particular front. And the last one, which has now gained a lot of traction in the last 3 years, is around data protection and privacy. And what we need to understand is that privacy does not relate to the organization data. Privacy relates to the personal data of the employees, of the customers, of the vendors, and so on and so forth. In 2018, in May, European Union launched something called as GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, whereby if the organization fails to cater to protecting the personal data, it can be a mobile number, it can be passport number, it can be name, age, any information with which you can identify an individual, including IP addresses. If an organization fails to do that, they can be fined minimum 20%, 20 million euros or 4% of the global revenue. So again, this is a very, very important discipline and gaining traction even in the Middle East. So all in all, these are the 7 domains which should have a lot of focus from the organizations, depending on the size, the nature of operations, the budgets, to make sure that the cybersecurity risk posture is minimum, or let's say it's reduced, and the organizations are in a space where they can respond to cybersecurity risks. Now moving on to the last section, which is around COVID-19 and what we have seen. So when last year or early last year, when the pandemic grew upon us, what we saw was that organizations were trying to work or implement remote working methodologies, infrastructure, which resulted in almost 300 to 600% of social engineering and phishing attacks, because employees were not used to work in a teleworking model where they will get support from IT remotely. And a lot of attackers leverage this and they pose like they are IT employees trying to help the workers. We saw staff shortage, whether due to medical reasons. So the outsourcing trend increased, and hence the third party risk also increased on the organizations. What we also saw was that because of the lack of basic infrastructure. So for example, in Kuwait, I know a lot of organizations didn't even have laptops because everybody was used to working on site. So the shortage of infrastructure also caused a lot of issues during COVID-19. And what we saw, or what was the response from the organizations, was that a lot of organizations conducted small rapid risk assessments on their VPN connectivity, or let's say the remote working connectivity. Organizations adopted an approach of pre-installing and configuring laptops. So the employees were given laptops which were configured as per the organization's practices. Policies were developed around teleworking or remote working. The security awareness was given to new employees, as a virtual security awareness session. And then organizations also implemented technologies like VPN or virtual private network to make sure that their connectivity is secured. Now, we are still not over from a COVID-19 perspective. So if you have to address cybersecurity within the COVID-19 context, what we need to understand and address is, are there any risks related to data leakage, data privacy? Since we are working remotely, do we still continue to patch our systems so that they are not subject to cybersecurity attacks, or let's say they can defend against cybersecurity attacks? If you are sourcing your staff because of the resource constraints from, let's say, a third party, does the third party understand their security responsibilities? Do they know your security policies and procedures, and so on and so forth? So what we have seen is during COVID-19, the shift has changed, or there is a shift in working model, which has brought its own risks. But what we've also seen, and good news is that organizations have adapted very rapidly to these changes. So in a nutshell, during COVID-19, and as we continue to basically recover from this, what we need to do is we need to prepare our systems so that they can be available to the employees that are remotely working through secure connectivity. We need to have an increased focus on security training and awareness, not just from a remote working perspective, but overall, what are the security domains and how the employees are responsible, to make sure that they follow the security policies. There are a lot of regulations that are coming up. So to ensure that these regulations, be it the health regulations, be it the cybersecurity regulations, they are followed. Organizations must ensure that they implement multi-factor authentication. So not just username and password, but a second mode of authentication as well. And then when we return, plan for those increased capacity and demands of the resources to ensure that our infrastructure caters to those demands. And there are a lot of elements to this, but simply put, we must ensure that our employees understand what they need to do in case they are targeted. They should understand what are the various methodologies by which they can be targeted. The systems must be regularly patched. The connectivity must be secured. We must implement multi-factor authentication. At the end of the day, when the employees come back, the systems must have the right capacity to cater to the demands. So in terms of COVID-19, and we will conclude the session after this slide, is basically, if you look at now, make sure that your policy procedures are up to date. Employees are given awareness training. You have deployed leading technologies, again, depending on the budget constraints and the size of the organization. And to ensure that if you are outsourcing, the third party understands their responsibilities as well. From a next perspective, we need to conduct risk assessments, realign our strategies, realign employee targets, even employee KPIs, and add cybersecurity KPIs to that. Understand what is the current workload if you're moving to cloud and how it will benefit you, and have cybersecurity being a very key part of those negotiations with the cloud providers in case you're going for a cloud. Ensuring that your systems are patched and updated on regular basis, and that you address third-party security measures in case you plan to go for outsourcing. And then really this is around the beyond is basically 2 years and upwards, where cybersecurity must be act like a business advisor and not just a technological aspect. You must have a strategy in place, which addresses people, process, and technology. Um, One of the key things which we see missing within the organizations is a lot of security measures are deployed, but their performance is not monitored. So we must ensure that we have proper performance indicators and key risk indicators, which are basically early warning signs of a cybersecurity attack going in, and implementing all of these capabilities to ensure that organizations work very securely. With this, I would like to conclude the session. Many thanks to Mulla Exchange Company and Modern Exchange Company. And if you have any questions, you can share with the Mulla Exchange team, and I'll be happy to respond to that. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is John Simon. I'm the General Manager of Mulla Exchange. I hope all of you enjoyed this webinar. This talk was broadcasted in Kuwait and Oman on behalf of Mulla Exchange Kuwait and Modern Exchange Oman. We would like to say our heartfelt thanks to Sourabh Sharma for his very enlightening seminar. Like our director mentioned, customers are our assets. And we at Mulla Exchange and Modern Exchange are proud to be part of your success story. Considering the complexity of the subject, Sourabh was able to give us a very lucid talk, understandable to all. The different scenarios which he had mentioned is quite relatable in our day-to-day operations and life, and something which we come across every day. So we hope through today's webinar, you have been able to take away some very valid points that can be enforceable at the workplace. We also understand you might have some questions that you would like to ask Sourabh, and like he mentioned, you can write into us, we will consult with him and get back to you. Thank you all for attending this seminar and have a very pleasant evening. Thank you.